Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much for joining this class or this module on computer security and forensics. So during our previous lecture, we managed to discuss the fundamentals of cybersecurity. We went a step further and we deliberated on the history of information security, what information security is, the critical characteristics of information security, the security goals. We also went a step further and defined what is cybersecurity and how we can protect our systems from cyber activities. So today we're going to go a step further and we're going to be discussing on threats and attacks. So at the end of this chapter or of this unit, you're going to know what is a threat and what is an attack. And you're also going to know how we categorize threats or how we can create a threat catalog, etc. So there are basic terminologies that you have to know that we're constantly going to be referring or talking about during this unit of threats and attacks. So first and foremost, we're going to define what a vulnerability is. So basically, a vulnerability is simply a loophole, a weakness, or a fault that can actually lead to an exposure. That's a vulnerability. We also mentioned another term known as exposure. So exposure is simply a successful attack. Some of you might be wondering, what is a threat? So a threat is a generic term for objects or people who pose a danger or a potential danger to an asset. That's a threat. But we cannot talk about a threat without mentioning a threat agent. So a threat agent is a specific object or a person who poses such a danger by simply carrying out an attack. That's what we refer to as a threat agent. So, to illustrate this point, we have a distributed denial of service attacks are a threat. If a hacker carries out a distributed denial of service attack, he is a threat agent. So the distributed denial of service attack is the threat, and then the hacker is simply the threat agent. We also need to know what is a risk. So a risk is the probability that something bad might happen and there is some form of expected damage to the organization. So unlike vulnerabilities or exploits, for example, a web service running on a server may have a vulnerability, But if it's not connected to the network, the risk is 0. We also have another term known as a vector. So a vector is simply how the attack is going to be carried out. That's a vector. An example is making use of malicious software. Malware. Malware is simply malicious code such as a virus, a worm, a Trojan horse, a bot, a backdoor, spyware, and adware, only to mention a few. So the moment you hear about the word malware, you have to know that it's simply malicious code that operate uh, differently. That's malware. Then we also have a term known as disclosure. So disclosure is simply responsibility, full, partial, none, delayed, etc. So you can either have a full disclosure, a partial disclosure, or non-disclosure. In cyber security and forensics, we also have a term known as authentication. So, determining the identity of a person, a computer, or a service on a computer is what we refer to as authentication. You will discover that when we are dealing with mobile banking or online banking, first and foremost, a username and a password is required as a way of authenticating that this particular user is the authorized account holder. Then in nowadays they have they have two-factor authentication through the use of a one-time password. It's also a way of trying to determine the identity of a person in this particular example. Authorization. So authorization is simply determining whether an entity, that is a person, a program, or a computer, has access to an object. It can be implicit, which means an email account access, or explicit, that which is attributes specifying users or groups who can actually read, write, or execute a file. So, we can also talk about an incident. So, an incident is simply any attack or all attacks using a vulnerability or anything resulting in service degradation other than problem management or service request fulfillment. That's an incident. So, with what we call threats to information security or threats to cybersecurity. So, in this particular case, we have come up with a threat catalog or a category of threats. So basically, this list of threats will actually help the information security specialist or the cyber security specialist to identify threats that are most likely to harm our critical asset within our organization. So, the first category of threats is acts of human error or failure. Accidents or employee mistakes are a threat to information security or are a threat to cybersecurity, in the sense that, let's say for instance, if an employee forgets to put a password or forgets to lock his or her machine before actually leaving a particular room or a particular venue. In this particular case, somebody might just come in and access resources that he or she is not authorized to access. So, an accident or an employee mistake or an error is an act of human error or failure, is a threat to our critical infrastructure. We also have a compromise to intellectual property. When we talk about intellectual property, we have things such as privacy or piracy. We have copyright infringement as an example of a compromise to intellectual property. You will discover that, especially in our country, Zimbabwe, we have we use lots of pirated software, and we also buy softwares that have been pirated or music that have been pirated. So, a compromise to intellectual property is a threat to information security or a threat to cyber security. We also have deliberate acts of espionage or trespass. In this particular instance, an unauthorized access or data collection is an example of a deliberate act of espionage or trespass. We also have deliberate acts of information extortion. Usually, this takes the forms of blackmail of information disclosure. This is a deliberate act of information extortion and is a threat to our cybersecurity or a threat to our information security. We can also decide to categorize threats in terms of deliberate acts of sabotage or vandalism. So, usually, when we talk about vandalism, we are looking at the destruction of critical system as well as information that is very, very vital to our organization. We also have deliberate acts of theft. So, if there is an illegal confiscation of equipment or information, then we term that as theft. If someone steals information, that's a threat to information security or a threat to cyber security. We also have deliberate software attacks. Deliberate software attacks usually makes use of malicious code or malware, and these software attacks might make use of viruses, worms, macros, or denial of service. As a way of also trying to categorize threats, we can have forces of nature. So forces of nature can be a flood, can be an earthquake, can be a fire, or a lightning, or even sometimes any natural disaster that you can think of. Another category of threat is deviation in quality of service from service providers. An example can be power or wide area network service issues. Let's say, for instance, before a service provider actually provides a service to a customer or to a particular user, these two parties sign a service level agreement. So it's within this service level agreement that those two parties actually agree to the terms of conditions or terms of service. So now, any deviation in the quality of service from the service provider is or might be a threat to our cybersecurity or a threat to our information security. We also have what we call technical hardware failures or errors. Sometimes you will discover that equipment might actually fail. And when a certain piece of equipment fails, like let's say for instance, we'll take Econet as an example. Econet has a service that it provides to customers, a service known as EcoCache. You can imagine, let's say for instance, if the server for EcoCache fails, or if it crashes and Econet doesn't have some form of backup, then at the end of the day, that can be a threat to information security or cyber security. Another category of threat is what we call technical software failures or errors. You will discover that softwares have to be upgraded or hardened or patched in order to avoid bugs or code problems or unknown loopholes that might lead the organization to be vulnerable. There is also a category of threat that falls under technological obsolescence. Sometimes as an organization can have outdated technologies. Let's say for instance, some organization, they might be using Windows XP as an operating system, and some of the applications that are being used within their infrastructures are making use of Windows XP. So Windows XP has known the vulnerabilities that it has. So if an organization uses that operating system, we say that organization is using outdated technologies, and that can be a threat to our cyber security. So, acts of human error or failure includes acts performed with malicious, without malicious intent. And causes might include, maybe one is inexperienced, or maybe the employees have not received, they've received improper training or incorrect assumptions. So employees are among the greatest threats to an organization's data. So acts of human error or failure is a threat to cyber security. An employee's mistake can actually lead to revelation of classified data, entry or erroneous data, accidental data deletion or modification, data storage in unprotected areas, or failure to protect information. Many of these threats can be prevented with control. Then there is also the issue of an insider threat. So, acts of human error or failure is a threat to cybersecurity. We also have what we call deliberate acts of espionage or trespass. So basically, access of protected information by unauthorized individuals and competitive intelligence, that is legal, versus industrial espionage, that is illegal. So shoulder surfing occurs anyway a person accesses confidential information. Controls actually lets the trespasser know they are encroaching an organization's cyberspace. And we say hackers use skills, glue, or fraud to actually bypass systems or critical systems within an organization. Deliberate acts of theft. So, deliberate acts of theft can be deemed as the illegal taking of another's physical, electronic, or intellectual property. So physical theft is controlled relatively easy, but however, electronic theft is more complex, and evidence of crime is not readily apparent. We also have what we call deliberate software attacks. So they are malware that actually designed to actually damage, destroy, or deny service to targeted system. And such malware or such examples of malicious software that we have are viruses, worms, Trojan horses, logic bombs, backdoors, denial of service, only to mention a few. So if you look closely on the slide, we have a Trojan horse attack. And we're basically saying we have a Trojan horse that is activated when the software or attachment is executed. And on the other hand, we have Trojan horse that actually arrives via an email or software such as free games. Then on the other end, we have a Trojan horse that actually releases its payload, monitors computer activity, and installs backdoor or transmit information to a hacker. Another threat to cybersecurity is forces of nature. And forces of nature are also amongst the most dangerous threats. They actually disrupt not only individual lives but also storage, transmission, and use of information. So basically, organization must implement controls to limit damage and prepare contingency plans for continued operation. Another category of threats is what we call deviations in quality of service. So this includes situations where products or services are not delivered as expected. So information system depends on many interdependent support systems. So the internet service, communication, and power irregularities dramatically affect the availability of information and systems. If you remember well, during our previous lecture, we say that there are basically three main security goals, or we have three components of the security triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. So on internet service issues, like what we are saying, you might have internet service provider failures that can considerably undermine the availability of information. Or outsourced web hosting provider assumes responsibility for all internet services as well as hardware and website operating system software. So we defined a threat as an object or a person that has the potential to expose harm to a system that's a threat. But however, an attack now is an action that simply exploits a vulnerability in a controlled system. An attack is an act or an action that exploits a vulnerability in a controlled system. A vulnerability in this particular case is an identified weakness. And we basically say an attack is usually accomplished by a threat agent which damages or steals organizations' information. So we do have what we call attack replication vectors. We defined a vector as a way or a method that an attack uses to exploit a particular system or an application. So we have various attack replication vectors. So an attacker can use a vector such as IP scan and attack. So basically, the IP scan and attack, the way in which it is used to perform an attack is by the infected system simply scans a random or local range of IP addresses and targets any of the several vulnerabilities known to hackers or left over from the previous exploits, such as the code red, the back orifice, or the poison box. An attacker can use a vector of web browsing. If the infected system has write access to any web pages, it makes all web content files such as the HTML, ASP, or the CGI infectious so that users who browse to those pages become infected. An attacker can use a virus as a vector. So each infected machine infects certain common executables or script files on all computers to which it can write with various code that can cause an infection. We have what we call unprotected shares. Using vulnerabilities in file systems and the way many organizations configure them, the infected machine copies the viral component to all locations it can actually reach. So some attackers make use of these unprotected shares to exploit our systems. Mass mail. So by sending email infections to addresses found in the address book, the infected machine infects many users whose mail reading programs also automatically run the programs and infect other systems. We have what we call simple network management protocol. By using the widely known and common passwords that were employed in the early versions of this protocol, which is used for remote management of network and computer devices, the attacking program can gain control of the device. So most vendors have actually closed these vulnerabilities with software upgrades. So as a way of preventing this attack vector of simple network management protocol, one has to make sure that the softwares that are being used within a particular organization are patched or are updated as a way of preventing such attack replication vectors from exploiting our systems. So, on attacks with what we call malicious code. So, malicious code includes execution of viruses, execution of worms, Trojan horse, and active web scripts with intent to destroy or steal information. As an attack, one might use what we call a backdoor. So a backdoor is used to gain access to our system or our network using known or previously unknown or newly discovered access mechanisms. So backdoor is also a type of attack, or one can make use of a backdoor to attack. In order to attack, one might make use of password crack. So a password crack is simply attempting to reverse calculate a password. That's what we refer to as a password crack. One might also make use of a brute force attack. So the moment one tries every possible combination of options of a password, then we say one is attacked using the brute force attack. We have what we call a dictionary attack. So a dictionary attack simply selects specific accounts to attack and uses commonly used password. that is the dictionary, to guide guesses. We have what we call a denial of service attack, or known as DOS attack. So with this type of an attack, an attacker simply sends large numbers of connection or information requests to a target, such that a target system cannot handle successfully, along with other legitimate service requests. This may or might actually result in a system to crash or inability to perform ordinary functions. That's how the denial of service attack operates. We also have what we call a distributed denial of service, known as the DDoS. So basically, this is a coordinated stream of requests that actually launched against target from many locations simultaneously. So the way in which a distributed denial of service, or DDoS, operates or works is it makes use of bots or botnets or zombies that it actually use to exploit a particular system. We also have what we call a spoofing attack. So this technique is actually used to gain unauthorized access. So an intruder simply assumes that a trusted IP address has been used. So we have what we call IP spoofing. We have what we call address resolution protocol spoofing, only to mention a few. We have what we call the man in the middle attack. So with this type of attack, an attacker simply monitors the network packets, modifies them, and inserts them back into the network. That's how the man in the middle attack operates. So basically, you have two people who are communicating. Let's just call them Alice and Bob. So when Alice actually sends a message to Bob, there's a third party or a man that is in the middle of these two parties. So let's call this person Death. So what Death simply does is, when a message is sent from Alice to Bob, Death intercepts that messages, modifies it, and sends it as if the message is originating from the authorized sender. We also have an attack known as spam. So spam is simply unsolicited commercial emails. These are more a nuisance than an attack, though some are actually emerging as a vector for some attack, or some are actually being used as a vector for some attacks. So with the man in the middle attack, as shown on the screen, Company A attempts to establish an encrypted session with Company B. So a hacker simply intercepts the transmission and poses as Company B. Hacker exchanges his own keys with Company A, and hacker then establishes a session with Company B, posing as Company A. So company B sends all the messages to the hacker, who receives, decrypts, copies, and forwards copies, possibly modified, to company B. Basically, this is how the man in the middle attack is done or is performed. So we have what we call mail bombing attacks. So a mail bombing attack is simply or is also a denial of service attack, in that an attacker routes large quantities of email to a target. We have what we call sniffers. Sniffers. So a program or a device that simply monitors data traveling over a network can be used both for legitimate purposes and for stealing information from a network. So as a cyberspace security specialist, you ought to protect your system from sniffers. There might be packet sniffers or other different types of sniffers. Social engineering attacks. So when one is using social engineering as an attack, one makes use of social skills to actually convince people to reveal access, credentials, or other valuable information to the attacker. We also have buffer overflow attacks. Sorry for that, I left an F and L on the overflow. So the buffer overflow attack is an application error occurring when more data is sent to a buffer than it can actually contain or hold. We also have a timing attack. So a timing attack explores contents of a web browser sketch to create malicious cookies. Side channel attacks secretly observes computer screen contents or electromagnetic radiation, keystrokes, sounds, etc.